300 people in a single grave. Viking axes and broken swords thrown in among the bones. And every skeleton, when the lab tested it, seemed to be lying about when it died. In the 1980s, archaeologists discovered them under the floor of a small church in Repton, England. They found the bones of close to 300 people packed tight around a stone structure, jumbled together rather than laid out as bodies. Among them, a battle axe, pieces of swords, unmistakable Viking weapons. Around 1 in 5 of the dead were women, and the history seemed to fit perfectly. 1100 years earlier, in 873 AD, a Viking army had wintered in this exact village on the River Trent. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that the Vikings forced the local king into exile. Then they settled in for the cold months. This grave sat full of Viking weapons in the one place the Great Army was known to have camped. Case closed. Except the dates didn't add up. When the bones went through radiocarbon dating, the results spanned centuries. Some skeletons looked hundreds of years too old to belong with the others. For decades, that one problem hung over the entire site. Maybe this wasn't the Great Army's grave at all. Maybe the Vikings had buried their dead in an older cemetery on top of bones that were already there. Then, in 2018, archaeologist Jarman and her team shifted focus. Instead of bones, they began examining what these people had eaten. Fish absorb carbon from the ocean, and ocean carbon reads older than the carbon in the air around us. Eat enough fish in your life, and that older signal seeps into your bones. Sometimes it can even change a radiocarbon date by 400 years. It's called the marine reservoir effect. Jarman's team measured how much fish was in each skeleton's diet, then corrected the dates to match. Every single one snapped back into the late 9th century, right on schedule for 873. The bones at Repton were never lying about when these people died. Their dinner was lying to the lab equipment. For more than 100 years, we've pictured Vikings as meat-loving warriors. They feasted on red meat and ale between raids and were seen as the top predators of early medieval Europe. DNA and the chemistry locked inside their own teeth say otherwise. To understand this, you must know what remains in a 1,000-year-old skeleton and where to find it. The first place is the plaque. The hardened layer on a tooth didn't get brushed away. Instead, it calcified and trapped whatever was in a person's mouth. Open it under a microscope and you'll see starch grains, plant fibers, and tiny bits of what someone last chewed, all sealed in for centuries. The second is the chemistry baked into bone and tooth enamel. Bone collagen's carbon and nitrogen ratios show what a person ate in the last 10 to 15 years. Eat mostly meat from land animals, and the numbers land one way. Eat plenty of fish, especially marine ones, and they often end up far away, sometimes in surprising places. Tooth enamel forms during childhood and doesn't change. This means it holds a permanent record of what someone ate and, often, where they were in the world before they turned teen. The third is the DNA itself. For decades, pulling usable ancient DNA out of a skeleton was mostly luck. Researchers discovered that one bone retains it better than others, the petrous bone. This dense part of the skull sits tucked behind the ear. Teeth turned out to be almost as good. In 2020, a team sequenced 442 whole genomes. They mostly used samples from teeth and petrous bones found in Viking-era graves across Europe and Greenland. Put plaque, bone chemistry, and DNA together, and a skeleton stops being a name on a museum label. It becomes a meal record, a travel log, and a secret family tree, all written into the same set of bones. Finding one. The fish in the bones. Start with the fish that confused the Repton dig. The well-known Viking origin story involves cattle and pigs. This warrior culture thrived on livestock, which they roasted over open fires. And Scandinavian farms did keep cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. But kill an animal and you eat it once. Pull a fish out of the water and you can do it again tomorrow. At Birka, a Viking Age trading town near modern Stockholm, researchers studied many skeletons. They used isotopes to analyze centuries of burials. Freshwater fish appeared again and again in the carbon and nitrogen signatures. It was a steady part of the diet for both men and women, generation after generation. Some people had isotope signatures that leaned heavily towards fish. On paper, they appeared almost coastal, even though Birka is on an inland lake. The same pattern shows up beyond Sweden. Archaeologists find a shift to large-scale fishing along the Norwegian coast, in Denmark, and across North Atlantic settlements. This change is seen in isotopes long before it appears in writing. In the later Viking Age, evidence shows organized dried fish production in Norway. This predates the first written records of the fish trade by at least a century. This is what threw off the Repton dating. The Great Army wasn't grabbing the occasional trout from a passing stream. Fish was baked into their bodies so deeply that it bent a radiocarbon clock by centuries. Salted herring, dried cod, split and hung to cure in the wind. Salmon cured in salt and dill, a method that's barely changed in 1,000 years. Drying and salting fish on this scale wasn't a side hobby. It allowed Viking crews to stock up for long voyages. This made their raids and trade routes possible. You don't sail to Iceland, Greenland, or beyond on fresh meat. Meat rots within days. Dried fish keeps for months. According to long-held beliefs, the meat and ale Viking ruled the food chain. They were the top predators of the medieval world. DNA and the isotopes locked into Viking bone say otherwise. The actual top of their food chain was swimming. Finding 2. The bread in the bank. Now the bread. Picture a Viking longhouse, and the image is fire, smoke, and a carcass on a spit. What's often missing from that picture is the quernstone in the corner. This flat grinding stone turned grain into flour daily. It was used in farmsteads from Norway to Iceland. Archaeobotanists study charred plant remains in Viking settlements. They often find the same few crops: barley, oats, and rye. Peas, flax, and cabbage are also common. Barley was the backbone. Ground into flour for flatbread, boiled into porridge, malted into ale. And ale wasn't an indulgence. Tea was a common drink for everyone: men, women, and children. Boiling the water during brewing made it safer than the water itself. The most famous piece of evidence in Viking archaeology was found under a bank. In 1972, workers building a new Lloyd's Bank in York made an amazing find. They uncovered a nearly perfect fossilized human stool, about 9 centuries old, buried in the city's wet soil. 8 inches long. An archaeologist later valued it at $39,000 for insurance. He said it was as irreplaceable as the crown jewels. Inside it, cereal bran, evidence of bread, and meat protein all together. It aligns well with what isotopes and archaeobotany revealed. A Viking in York eating bread, porridge, and any available meat. This was the routine, not the exception. For decades, the Paleo-Viking diet myth was that it was high in protein, with grain as an afterthought if it appeared at all. DNA, charred grain found in Viking farmsteads, and one famous fossilized stool from York tell a different story. Bread wasn't a side dish. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, with meat as the bonus on top. Finding 3. The milk in the barrel. Then there's the milk. Scandinavia isn't a gentle farming country. Short growing seasons, thin soil, brutal winters. What it does have is grass, and grass means animals,
cattle, sheep, goats. Animals mean milk. Fresh milk does not keep. So Norse farms turned it into things that do. Butter, packed and salted for storage. Hard cheese, salted enough to survive months. Skyr, a thick, sour, yogurt-like food still enjoyed in Iceland today. It's made much the same way as it was 1,000 years ago. Even the leftover whey got used, fermented into a sour drink called syra. This was how a Norse household got through winter. Historians say there's little proof of widespread malnutrition in Viking Age people. This is surprising given the harsh growing conditions. A key reason is their strong reliance on dairy. It's calorie-dense, it stores for months, and unlike a slaughtered pig, a cow keeps producing. It also left a mark on the genome. Scandinavians have some of the highest rates of lactase persistence in the world. This means they can keep digesting milk sugar into adulthood. It's the genetic mark of a population that has relied on dairy for generations. The gene for digesting dairy spread to almost everyone. For decades, the Paleo-Viking diet myth had no real place for milk. Dairy reads as soft, modern, the opposite of a raiding culture. DNA says otherwise. Some of the strongest evidence that dairy was central to Viking life isn't sitting in a museum. It's in the digestive systems of their descendants, walking around Scandinavia right now. Like this video, because what's coming next isn't about food anymore. It's about what was still living inside the Vikings. Finding 4. The worms in the gut. Go back to that famous stool from York. Bread and meat were only part of what was inside it. Under the microscope, researchers also found something else. Hundreds of parasite eggs. Whipworm, moorworm, a type of roundworm. This infection causes cramping, fatigue, and constipation. These symptoms might explain why this specimen was large enough to make headlines. That wasn't a one-off. York's Viking Age layers are soaked in waste. Archaeologists believe that about 1/3 of the 10-foot deep layers beneath the old city consist of trash from humans and animals. People, animals, and food scraps all lived in damp timber buildings. There was no sanitation like we have today. It's a picture that lines up with how outsiders described them. A 10th century Arab diplomat, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, met Norse traders on the Volga. He was shocked. He called them the filthiest of God's creatures. He was disgusted by how they shared one basin of water each morning. They used it to wash their faces and hair, blow their noses and spit, then passed it to the next man. Historians debate how much he exaggerated, but it's a striking match for what turned up under a Lloyd's bank. None of this fits the legend. The Viking in popular culture seems indestructible. They are toughened by cold water, raw meat, and battle. They ignore the soft complaints of settled life. But that Viking is a fiction written by people who never had to live next to a midden heap in Jorvik. Most people dealt with gut parasites regularly. This was common in many crowded societies before modern sanitation. Strength and toughness are key, but also consider stomach cramps, intestinal worms, and severe constipation. These issues could leave a record-breaking specimen for archaeologists to discover 1,000 years from now. The Viking body has been marketed for decades as the ideal of physical fitness, free from the weaknesses of modern life. DNA and a few hundred parasite eggs preserved in a Lloyd's Bank basement say otherwise. Even the toughest raiders in Europe were walking around with a stomach full of worms. The big picture. Here's where it stops being about food. Every finding so far has been about what went into a Viking's mouth. The biggest finding is about who that mouth belonged to. In 2020, a team from the University of Copenhagen launched the largest ancient DNA study of the Viking world. They sequenced 442 whole genomes.
Most samples came from teeth and petrous bones. They were found in graves across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Ukraine, Poland, Russia, the Baltic, and Greenland. 6 years of work, around 80 co-authors, a cover story in Nature. The common image of a Viking crew is clear: a boat of blonde Scandinavians linked by blood, raiding together. And sometimes the DNA backed that up exactly. In a ship burial on Saaremaa Island, off Estonia's coast, researchers found 4 brothers. They were all dead and buried together in the same boat on the same day. But just as often, the DNA told a completely different story. On Orkney, off Scotland's north coast, archaeologists found Viking-style skeletons. They were buried with their full gear, including swords. Every visual clue pointed to Scandinavian raiders. The DNA said otherwise. These men had ancestors from the local populations of Scotland and Ireland. Their grandparents weren't from Norway. They were from Orkney itself. They buried them,
Swords and all, as Vikings. About 10% of people in Sweden and 6% in the UK have detectable Viking-era ancestry based on the same data. Put it together, and Viking stops looking like a bloodline and starts looking like a job. A way of life, raiding, trading, farming, and settling. It's shaped by people from diverse backgrounds, all united in one word. For over 1,000 years, Viking has referred to a group, blonde, Scandinavian, sharing a diet and appearance. DNA pulled from their own teeth says otherwise. Some of the most Viking graves found belong to people with no Scandinavian ancestry at all. The Viking that never existed. So go back to Repton. For decades, the bones in that grave seemed to be lying about when these people died. They weren't. They spoke the truth about what these people ate. They provided more detail than anyone in the 1980s could understand. The meat and ale Viking, the blonde raider built on protein, was never hiding from the evidence. It took better tools to see beyond him. Isotopes revealed fish instead of beef. Charred grain outweighed all the meat in a longhouse. A fossilized stool gained fame over many buried at Repton. DNA mattered more than the sword in your grave. The real population ate bread and porridge. They ate more fish than red meat and relied on dairy during the long winters. They also shared gut parasites with others in 9th century Europe. And a good number of the people fighting under a Viking banner had never set foot in Scandinavia in their lives. The Viking wasn't a diet. He wasn't a bloodline either. He was a way of making a living on land and at sea, and his own teeth recorded every part of it. Scientists discovered something surprising. They looked at what was preserved, not just what the legend told. For centuries, we've learned about Pompeii's diet from frescoes, old cookbooks, and some charred loaves found in ovens. Educated guesswork dressed up as fact. Researchers looked at what Vesuvius sealed: bones, teeth, and even sewage. These items were frozen at the exact moment in 79 AD when everything came to a halt. If you want to learn what the researchers found, subscribe, because that's the story we're going to cover next.